Night falls on Ireland, February 1922. The sky over County Cork glows orange, not sunset fire. Mallow Castle, home to the Jeffson family for 3 centuries, burns from foundation to rooftop. Flames consume oak panelling imported from England in 1690. They devour libraries of first editions, portraits of ancestors, furniture carried across oceans. The heat shatters windows, stone walls, built to last millennia, crack and split. By dawn, only the shell remains. This is not an accident. This is not one house. In a single, coordinated night, Irish Republican Army brigades torch over 200 country estates across southern Ireland. 300 years of Anglo-Irish architecture gone. Mansions that survived Cromwell, the famine, centuries of tenant uprisings reduced to ash in hours. The IRA calls it military strategy. The British call it terrorism. History will call it something more complicated. These weren't just buildings. They were symbols of conquest, of wealth extracted from Irish soil by English landlords, of a system that kept Catholic peasants landless while Protestant gentry lived in palaces. Beautiful palaces, architecturally significant palaces, palaces nonetheless built on dispossession. This is the story of those houses. Who built them? Who burned them? And why the truth about Ireland's lost estates refuses to fit into simple narratives about heroes and villains. This is the dark story of Ireland's burned castles. Stand in the ruins of Moore Hall today. County Mayo on the shores of Loufcarra. The walls still rise 4 stories, limestone blackened by fire. Windows are hollow sockets. The roof is long gone. Raven's nest where chandeliers once hung. Ivy climbs through what was once a drawing room where Irish revolutionaries and British officers both dined, depending on the decade, depending on the war. This house burned in 1923. It has never been rebuilt. Across Ireland, from Cork to Galway to Wexford, the landscape is dotted with these ghosts. Roofless shells, crumbling gate lodges, overgrown gardens where peacocks once strutted and tennis courts rotted under nettles. Each ruin marks a vanished world. A world of big houses, as they were called. Estates owned almost exclusively by Protestant families of English or Scottish descent, ruling over predominantly Catholic Irish tenants who worked the land but could never own it. The burning of the big houses is one of the Irish Revolution's most controversial chapters. Between 1920 and 1923, during the War of Independence and the subsequent Civil War, approximately 275 country houses were destroyed. Some were military targets, the homes of loyalists, informers, or active opponents of independence. Some housed British troops or intelligence officers. Some were burned as reprisals, punishment for atrocities committed by Crown forces in nearby towns. And some, it must be said, were simply burned because they represented centuries of colonial oppression, and rage does not always pause to calculate the historical value of what it destroys. The British called it cultural vandalism, destruction of irreplaceable architecture. Proof that Irish revolutionaries were barbaric, incapable of appreciating civilization. They published photographs of charred ruins. They catalogued losses, paintings, libraries, furniture, entire lineages of domestic history turned to ash. They mourned the estates as monuments to refinement, taste, and centuries of careful cultivation. The Irish Republicans saw it differently. These houses, they argued, were not neutral art objects. They were fortresses of occupation, symbols of a landed class that had profited from famine, eviction, and systemic impoverishment of the Irish people. Every grand estate had been built with rent extracted from tenant farmers who lived in one-room cottages, who watched their children die of hunger, while grain grown on Irish soil was exported to England. To preserve those houses, Republicans believed, would be to preserve the memory of subjugation. Better to erase them, better to start fresh. Both perspectives contain truth. Both omit essential complexity. The reality is that Ireland's big houses were neither pure monuments to civilization nor simple symbols of tyranny. They were, like most architecture, touched by empire morally tangled, beautiful and brutal, repositories of art and instruments of control. Places where laborers were treated with relative decency by the standards of the time and still systematically denied power, land, and dignity. This is the story of those houses. Not just what they looked like, but what they meant. Who lived in them, who served them, who resented them, and who mourned them. It is a story about architecture as politics, about beauty built on inequality, about the impossible choices revolutionary movements face when history and injustice are literally carved into stone. We will walk through the ruins. We will trace the lives of owners, servants, and revolutionaries. We will examine how estates functioned, how wealth flowed, and how violence, both structural and sudden, shaped the landscape. We will ask hard questions about preservation and destruction, about what deserves to survive and what must be reckoned with before it can be honored. This is not a simple story. It does not resolve into heroes and villains. It is a story about land, power, memory, and the price people pay on all sides when those things collide. This is the dark story of Ireland's burned castles. The big houses began arriving in Ireland in the 1600s, planted deliberately across a conquered landscape. These were not organic growths, not medieval castles evolving over centuries. They were colonial architecture, imported wholesale from England and Scotland, designed to announce permanence and dominance. After Cromwell's brutal campaigns of the 1650s, and again after the Williamite Wars of the 1690s, vast tracts of Irish land were confiscated from Catholic families and redistributed to Protestant settlers. The new landlords needed houses, not just shelter statements, buildings that said, "We are here, we are civilized, we are in control, and we are not leaving." The architectural vocabulary was borrowed directly from English country estates. Palladian symmetry ruled. Classical proportions governed every measurement. Irish limestone, carefully dressed, formed facades that could have been lifted from England and dropped into Cork or Galway. Grand entrance halls opened to sweeping staircases. Libraries were panelled in oak. Drawing rooms featured marble fireplaces and tall windows offering commanding views of the surrounding estate land that had been Irish before it was surveyed, divided, and claimed under English law. These houses spoke a language of order, refinement, and imperial confidence. They were designed to look eternal, as if they had always been there and always would be. Every architectural choice reinforced hierarchy. This is civilization. The houses announced, and we brought it here. The reality was more violent. The land these houses occupied had been seized through acts of staggering brutality. Cromwell's forces killed an estimated 200,000 Irish between 1649 and 1653. Catholic landowners who had held estates for centuries were stripped of their property. Protestant settlers moved in and built houses on confiscated ground, using stone from Irish mountains, timber from Irish forests, and labor from Irish workers who now lived as tenants on land their ancestors had owned. The houses were beautiful, undeniably architecturally genuinely beautiful. Castletown House in County Kildare remains one of Ireland's finest Palladian buildings. Rusborough House in Wicklow stretches over 700 feet. Strokestown Park in Roscommon features a vaulted stable yard and perfectly preserved estate village. These were sophisticated works of architecture, products of Enlightenment ideals about proportion and harmony. Irish craftsmen contributed immensely. Stonemasons developed techniques for working limestone that equaled anything in England. Plasterers created ceiling decorations that rivaled the finest Rococo work in Europe. Carpenters shaped native oak into staircases and paneling that would last centuries. But sophistication does not erase origin. These houses were instruments of conquest dressed in classical clothing. They were built to root the new landholding class so deeply into the Irish landscape that their presence would become unchallengeable. They succeeded for over 2 centuries. The Irish tenants who worked the land understood differently. To them, the big houses were monuments to dispossession. Beautiful, yes. Impressive, certainly. But built on theft, sustained by rents extracted from people who had no choice but to pay or starve. By the early 20th century, these houses had stood for 200 to 300 years. long enough that many landlord families considered themselves genuinely Irish. Not long enough to be forgiven. The houses were beautiful. The houses were built on violence. Both things were true, and when the fires started, both truths burned together. The big house did not exist in isolation. It was the administrative and economic center of an estate system that organized Irish rural life for over 200 years. A typical estate might cover thousands of acres, divided into tenant farms worked by Irish Catholic families who paid rent to the Protestant landlord. The landlord rarely worked the land himself. His income was extracted rent, collected by agents, sometimes with ruthless efficiency, sometimes with violent coercion. Tenants had no security. Leases could be cancelled, rents could be raised. Entire villages could be cleared to make way for grazing cattle, which fetched better prices in English markets than grain or potatoes. The system was designed for extraction, not partnership. Tenant farmers paid rent twice yearly, at gale days in May and November. Miss a payment and eviction followed swiftly. The landlord's agent, often despised more than the landlord himself, rode circuit collecting rents, hearing complaints, dispensing justice or injustice depending on temperament and instructions. Some agents were fair, many were not. All had absolute power over families who had nowhere else to go. The math was brutal. A tenant family might farm 20 or 30 acres, growing potatoes for themselves and grain or raising livestock for market. After paying rent, buying seed, and covering basic necessities, little remained. There was no path to ownership, no possibility of accumulation. You farmed the same plot your father and grandfather had farmed, paying rent in perpetuity to a family whose claim to the land rested on confiscation 2 centuries prior. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 exposed the system's cruelty with hideous clarity. When potato blight destroyed the crop that fed the majority of Ireland's population, approximately 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Another million emigrated. Yet throughout the famine, grain continued to be exported from Irish estates under armed guard. Ireland was producing enough food to feed its population. That food simply belonged to landlords, not to the people starving in the fields where it was grown. Some landlords provided relief. They opened soup kitchens, reduced rents, petitioned the government for aid. The Mann family at Strokestown spent heavily on relief efforts. It bankrupted them and did not save them from resentment. Others did nothing or worse. Some evicted starving tenants for non-payment of rent, demolishing cottages to prevent reoccupation, clearing entire townlands to consolidate farms or convert land to more profitable grazing. Contemporary records are stark. William Stuart Twench, a land agent, wrote in his memoirs about the evictions he oversaw, "The scenes I witnessed were heart-rending. Women, children, and old men turned out on the roadside in winter, without shelter." He conducted these evictions on orders from landlords living comfortably in their big houses, insulated by walls and servants, from the consequences of their decisions. Not all landlords were monsters. Many genuinely believed they were fulfilling their duty, providing employment, maintaining order, managing resources responsibly. Some were progressive, building schools, improving roads, investing in local infrastructure. But even the best landlords operated within a system fundamentally structured to benefit them at tenants' expense. Benevolence was individual. Exploitation was systemic. The big house, with its elegant proportions and manicured gardens, sat at the center of this apparatus. The rent that paid for the mansion's upkeep, the servants' wages, the imported furniture, the wine cellars, and the annual trips to London came directly from tenant farmers living in one-room cottages with mud floors and thatched roofs. The beauty upstairs and the poverty outside were not separate phenomena. They were 2 sides of the same economic relationship. By the 1880s, tenants began to resist collectively. The land war spread across Ireland: rent strikes, boycotts, intimidation of agents and loyalists. The British government, fearing outright revolution, began passing land reform acts that allowed tenants to purchase their farms with government loans. By 1914, much of Ireland's land had transferred to tenant ownership, But the big houses remained, increasingly anachronistic, expensive reminders of a system that had extracted wealth for centuries and left scars that legislation could not erase. Every big house required a small army to function. Butlers, housekeepers, cooks, maids, footmen, grooms, gardeners, gamekeepers, laundresses, dairymaids, positions that could number anywhere from 20 to over 100 depending on the estate's size. These jobs were coveted. Servants earned wages, received meals and lodging, and enjoyed a degree of security tenant farmers lacked. Working in the big house marked you as respectable, industrious, slightly elevated above the landless poor. But the work was grueling, the hierarchy rigid, and the deference absolute. The day began before the family woke. Housemaids rose at 5 or earlier to light fires in every occupied room. In winter, this meant carrying coal scuttles up narrow servants' staircases, kneeling before cold grates, coaxing flames to life before the lady of the house opened her eyes. Water had to be heated and carried in pitchers for washing, chamber pots emptied, floors swept. All of this accomplished silently, invisibly, so that when the family emerged from their bedrooms, the house appeared to run itself. The hierarchy below stairs mirrored the one above, only more intricate. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, authorities in their separate domains. The butler controlled the male staff footmen, valets, hall boys, and managed the wine cellar, the silver, and formal service. The housekeeper commanded the female staff ladies' maids, housemaids, kitchen maids, laundresses, and kept inventories of linens, china, and household supplies. Both reported to the lady of the house, but wielded considerable independent power. A word from the butler or housekeeper could make or break a servant's career. Below them, ranks descended with military precision. Ladies' maids and valets, who dressed the family and maintained their wardrobes, held privileged positions. They traveled with their employers, handled intimate tasks, and absorbed reflected status. Housemaids scrubbed, dusted, and polished, divided into head housemaids, upper housemaids, and under housemaids, each with defined territories and tasks. Kitchen maids peeled vegetables, washed dishes, and endured the cook's temper in sweltering kitchens. Scullery maids, at the bottom, did the filthiest work for the lowest pay. Outside, the hierarchy continued. Head gardeners supervised teams who maintained acres of formal gardens, kitchen gardens, and greenhouses. Grooms tended horses and carriages. Gamekeepers managed the estate's hunting grounds, a serious business since shooting parties were both sport and social currency. Dairymaids milked cows and churned butter. Laundresses wrestled with mountains of sheets, tablecloths, and clothing in separate laundry buildings equipped with massive coppers for boiling water. Wages varied by position and gender. A butler in a substantial Irish estate in 1900 might earn £50 to £80 annually, plus room, board, and tips from guests. A head housemaid earned perhaps £20 to £30. A scullery maid, £8 to £12. Men were paid more than women for equivalent work. All were paid far less than their labor was worth, the difference absorbed by employers as part of the natural order. The work demanded constant deference. Servants were expected to make themselves invisible, to turn toward walls when family members passed in corridors, to speak only when spoken to absorb insults without response. The rules were unwritten, but absolute. Break them, and you were dismissed, often without the reference letter essential for finding new employment. A servant dismissed for insubordination, theft, or moral impropriety was effectively unemployable in respectable houses. Yet employment in a big house offered real advantages. You ate regularly, a luxury in rural Ireland where hunger was common. You had shelter, clothing, and sometimes even access to education if the family was progressive. You learned skills cooking, needlework, household management that were portable. And you gained a certain social standing. Families boasted of daughters in service at the big house. It meant you were trusted, respectable, part of the structure that held society together. The relationship between servant and employer was paternalistic. Good landlords genuinely cared for their staff, remembered birthdays, inquired about sick relatives, provided small gifts at Christmas. Some paid for medical care or helped servants' children find positions. This kindness was real. It was also control. Gratitude and dependence kept servants loyal, obedient, and unlikely to question a system that gave them stability while denying them power. Servants knew the mansion intimately. They knew which doors locked, which windows opened easily, where valuables were stored, how the family moved through their day. They knew the servants' passages, the back staircases, the hidden corridors designed to keep them invisible. They understood the house's vulnerabilities in ways owners never considered. That knowledge would matter when the revolution came and the big houses became targets. Servants faced impossible choices. Loyalty to employers who had fed and sheltered them, or solidarity with neighbors and kin who saw those same houses as symbols of oppression. Some warned their employers of coming raids. Some quietly disappeared before the fires started. And some, it must be said, helped light the match. Despite their political toxicity, Ireland's big houses were often architectural masterpieces. Architects like Richard Castles, James Gandon, and Francis Johnston designed buildings of genuine beauty and innovation. Castletown House in County Kildare, Powerscourt in Wicklow, Strokestown Park in Roscommon, these were not derivative copies of English estates, but sophisticated works that adapted Palladian and neoclassical forms to Irish materials and landscapes. Irish craftsmen, stonemasons, plasterers, woodcarvers brought extraordinary skill to the work. Ceilings were decorated with intricate stucco work, rococo fantasies of birds, garlands, and mythological figures. Libraries were panelled in native oak or imported mahogany. Staircases curved with mathematical precision, their proportions calculated to create drama and flow. Richard Castles, born in Germany and trained in continental techniques, arrived in Ireland in the 1720s and transformed the architectural landscape. His Castletown house, begun in 1722, established the template. A central block with flanking wings connected by curved colonnades, the whole composition balanced with geometric perfection. The entrance hall rises through 2 stories, its proportions governed by classical ratios. The staircase, added later, sweeps upward in a graceful curve, its plasterwork ceiling depicting mythological scenes in such fine detail that individual feathers on birds' wings remain visible 3 centuries later. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Irish stucadores, many trained by Italian masters who had come to Ireland in the early 1700s, developed a distinctive style. The Lafroncini brothers, working across multiple estates, created plasterwork that combined Italian Baroque exuberance with Irish motifs, harps, wolfhounds, Celtic patterns worked into classical frameworks. Their ceilings were not simply decorative. They were 3-dimensional sculptures in lime plaster, built up layer by layer, carved and modeled while still wet, requiring perfect timing and absolute confidence. Stonemasons worked Irish limestone and granite with techniques refined over generations. The stone had character: warm grey, sometimes golden, harder than English Portland stone but more responsive to the chisel. Masons cut blocks to precise dimensions, dressed surfaces smooth or left them rusticated for texture, carved ornamental details that would weather centuries of rain and wind. The best work, like the facade of Rusborough House or the portico at Carton House, demonstrates mastery equal to anything in Georgian England. Woodcarvers shaped Irish oak, a dense hardwood that dulled tools but took details beautifully. Library paneling required hundreds of hours measuring, cutting, fitting each piece so joints were invisible, carving moldings and cornices, applying the final polish that brought out the wood's figure. Staircases demanded both engineering and artistry. The treads had to be mathematically calculated for comfortable rise and run. The balusters had to be turned on lathes to identical profiles. The handrails had to curve smoothly, supported by newel posts strong enough to bear weight yet elegant enough to complement the whole. Many houses contained art collections of museum quality. Old master paintings hung in drawing rooms, works attributed to Titian, Rubens, Gainsborough. Classical sculpture occupied entrance halls. Libraries held rare books and manuscripts, some illuminated by medieval monks. others first editions of works that shaped Western thought. These collections represented decades of careful acquisition, the taste and wealth of multiple generations. The irony cuts deep. These objects of beauty, created with genuine artistry and enormous labor, existed inside structures that symbolized and perpetuated profound injustice. The stucco ceilings and carved staircases were paid for with rent extracted from tenant farmers. The paintings and sculpture were purchased with wealth generated by a system that kept the majority of Ireland's population impoverished and powerless. The Irish craftsmen who created the beauty, the masons, carpenters, and plasterers, were themselves caught in the same economic trap. They earned wages, yes, better than farm laborers, but they could never own the houses they built, never commission art for themselves, never accumulate the kind of wealth their employers took for granted. When the houses began to burn, irreplaceable art was lost. Paintings consumed by flames. Plasterwork cracked and collapsed as roofs burned through. Libraries went up like kindling, rare books reduced to ash in minutes. From a purely aesthetic and historical perspective, the destruction was catastrophic. Works that had survived centuries, that represented the pinnacle of Georgian and Victorian craftsmanship, vanished in single nights. The question history cannot settle is whether that loss was tragedy, justice, or both. Can beauty created within and funded by an unjust system be separated from that system? Does the artistic merit of a house absolve the economic exploitation that built it? If you burn a mansion to destroy a symbol of oppression, are you also destroying evidence of human creativity and skill that transcends politics? The Irish revolutionaries who torched the big houses were not vandals ignorant of what they destroyed. Many understood exactly what was being lost. They made a calculated decision. The symbolic and strategic value of destroying these houses outweighed their aesthetic and historical importance. The houses represented a system that had to end. Preserving them meant preserving the memory and perhaps the reality of that system. Architects and preservationists at the time and since have argued that architecture should be protected regardless of politics, that buildings are part of human heritage beyond any single nation or ideology. The counter-argument is that this position is itself political, that it privileges aesthetic values over justice, that it asks the oppressed to preserve monuments to their oppression in the name of universal culture. There is no resolution. The houses burned. The art was lost. What remains are ruins, photographs, and the unresolved tension between beauty and complicity, between preservation and revolution, between the value of what was created and the cost of how it was created. By the 1880s, the estate system was cracking. The land war, a mass movement of tenant resistance, spread across Ireland. Tenants refused to pay rent. They boycotted landlords and agents literally. The term boycott was coined in 1880 when tenants ostracized Captain Charles Boycott, a land agent in County Mayo. Secret agrarian societies intimidated loyalists, maimed cattle, burned haystacks. The British government responded with coercion acts, mass arrests, and military deployments. But it also began passing land reform laws that allowed tenants to purchase their holdings with government loans. The spark was economic. Agricultural depression in the late 1870s devastated Irish farming. Crop failures and falling prices left tenant farmers unable to pay rents set during more prosperous times. Landlords, many heavily mortgaged themselves, demanded payment. Evictions multiplied. Families were thrown onto roadsides, their cottages demolished. Into this crisis stepped the Irish National Land League, founded in 1879 by Michael Davitt, whose own family had been evicted when he was a child. The League's program was revolutionary: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. Tenants should pay only what land could reasonably produce, have security against eviction, and build equity over time. Charles Stewart Parnell, a Protestant landlord and Member of Parliament, became the League's public face. Under his leadership, the land war became organized and strategically sophisticated. Tenants on targeted estates would collectively refuse rent. When landlords moved to evict, entire communities resisted blocking roads, hiding families, making evictions impossible. Social ostracism proved devastatingly effective. Captain Boycott, managing an estate in Mayo, attempted to evict tenants in 1880. The entire community cut him off. Workers quit. Shops refused service. His mail stopped. He could not hire laborers. His crops rotted in the fields. Boycott eventually fled Ireland, his name forever attached to the tactic that defeated him. Violence accompanied the organizing. Agrarian secret societies enforced boycotts with threats and action. Cattle were maimed, haystacks burned. Landlords and agents who pushed too hard were sometimes shot, though the League officially condemned violence. The British response was heavy-handed. The government imprisoned Land League leaders and deployed troops to protect evictions. But Prime Minister Gladstone also recognized that coercion alone would not work. The Land Act of 1881 granted tenants fair rent and security. Subsequent acts provided government loans allowing tenants to purchase farms outright. By 1914, most Irish tenant farmers had become owner-occupiers. The transfer fundamentally altered Ireland's social structure. The landlord class lost its economic foundation. Without rent rolls, many could not afford to maintain estates. Some sold their big houses and left Ireland. Others stayed on diminished terms, no longer unquestioned masters but simply large landowners among many smaller ones. Yet the big houses remained, physical reminders of the old system. And the memory of what that system had done, the evictions, the hunger, the generations of insecurity did not fade with land reform. The houses had been symbols of power. They remained symbols of historical grievance. By the 1910s, as Irish nationalism evolved from land agitation to demands for political independence, the big houses became increasingly problematic. Their owners, overwhelmingly Protestant and often Unionist, were seen as naturally aligned with British rule. Some were vocally opposing Home Rule and independence. Others were ambivalent or even sympathetic. It did not matter. The houses they lived in marked them as part of the old order, the colonial apparatus that had to be dismantled. The land war had proven collective action could break landlord power. The lesson was not lost on the generation that would fight for independence. The big houses were vulnerable. All it would take was will, organization, and a match. The Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, turned the big houses into battlegrounds. The IRA needed weapons, intelligence, safe houses, and funds. Some estates provided them willingly. There were Protestant landlords sympathetic to independence, or at least pragmatic enough to cooperate. Others became targets. Houses suspected of sheltering British officers or black and tans, the paramilitary police force notorious for brutality, were raided or burned. Mansions doubled as barracks. Their walls offered protection. Their larders fed troops. When Crown forces left, the IRA moved in. When the IRA withdrew, reprisals followed. The pattern began slowly, then accelerated. In 1919 and early 1920, raids on big houses were mostly about acquiring weapons. Many landlords kept shotguns and rifles for hunting. The IRA needed arms desperately. Raiding parties would arrive at night, force entry, collect firearms, and disappear. Some raids were polite, almost apologetic. Others were violent, with families held at gunpoint while volunteers searched. Then the violence deepened. British forces, stretched thin and facing an enemy they could not identify, began using big houses as temporary barracks. A mansion offered defensible stone walls, clear sightlines, rooms for troops, and stables for vehicles. Crown forces would requisition an estate for days or weeks, displacing the family or confining them to a few rooms while soldiers occupied the rest. When they left, the house became a target. The IRA's logic was military. If a house sheltered British forces, it was a legitimate military objective. Burning it denied the enemy a resource and sent a message to other landlords. Cooperation with Crown forces carried consequences. The burnings began in 1920. A manor house in Cork, then one in Tipperary, then more. Each fire was reported in local and national newspapers, each one raising the stakes. Landlords found themselves trapped between sides, refused to cooperate with British forces, and you risked arrest, fines, or worse. Cooperate and you risked IRA reprisal. Some families fled to Dublin or England, abandoning their houses to whatever fate awaited. Others stayed, believing their local standing, their history of fair treatment, their personal relationships would protect them. Sometimes it did, often it did not. Informers faced special fury. The IRA's effectiveness depended on secrecy and local support. Landlords who reported IRA activity to police or military authorities were marked for punishment. In several documented cases, estates belonging to known informers were burned with specific, stated justification. You betrayed your neighbors. Your house is forfeit. Reprisals flowed both ways. British forces, particularly the Black and Tans and the Auxiliary Division, responded to IRA attacks by burning homes of suspected Republicans. Mostly these were cottages and small farms, but some larger houses belonging to Catholic nationalist families were torched as well. The violence spiraled. An IRA ambush would be followed by Crown reprisals, which would trigger IRA counter-reprisals, each cycle expanding the list of targets. By 1921, dozens of big houses had been destroyed. Not systematically, there was no centralized IRA campaign ordering the burning of all landlord estates. Decisions were made at brigade and battalion level, based on local intelligence, local grievances, and local commanders' judgment. Some IRA units burned houses aggressively. Others avoided it, viewing the destruction of historic buildings as wasteful or counterproductive. The burnings created deep rifts. Many Irish people, including Republicans, were horrified by the destruction of architectural heritage. Nationalist newspapers published editorials condemning the fires as vandalism that hurt Ireland's international reputation. Others defended them as necessary acts of war against a colonial system that had oppressed Ireland for centuries. The truce in July 1921 ended the War of Independence, but not the burning. The houses had become symbols in a way that transcended their military utility. They represented everything many Irish people wanted to leave behind: English rule, Protestant ascendancy, landlordism, colonialism. The Anglo-Irish Treaty signed in December 1921 was supposed to settle these questions. Instead, it split the independence movement and plunged Ireland into civil war. And in that civil war, the big houses would burn on a scale that made the War of Independence look restrained. The treaty signed in December 1921 gave Ireland independence but partitioned the island and required an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. The IRA split. Pro-treaty forces led by Michael Collins accepted it as a stepping stone to full sovereignty. Anti-treaty Republicans led by Aymon de Valera rejected it as betrayal. The resulting Civil War, 1922 to 1923, was more savage than the fight for independence. Irishmen who had fought together now killed each other, and the big houses burned in unprecedented numbers. The violence turned inward with shocking speed. In June 1922, pro-treaty Free State forces attacked the four courts in Dublin, held by anti-treaty Republicans. The Civil War had begun. Within weeks, the conflict spread across Southern Ireland. Former comrades became enemies. Brothers chose opposite sides. Communities fractured along lines of loyalty to the treaty or rejection of it. The big houses became targets in a new way. Anti-treaty IRA brigades torched estates belonging to pro-treaty politicians, Free State senators, and anyone associated with the new government. These were not British loyalists. These were Irish Protestants, and even some Catholics who had supported independence, but now backed the treaty. Their houses burned anyway. The Senate of the new Irish Free State included several Protestant landlords appointed to provide continuity and expertise. To anti-treaty Republicans, these appointments represented betrayal the old ascendancy class co-opted by a compromised government. In early 1923, a systematic campaign targeted senators' homes. On a single night in January, multiple mansions across Cork, Kerry, and Limerick went up in flames simultaneously, clearly coordinated. Sir Horace Plunkett's home, Kiltarog in County Dublin, burned in January 1923. Plunkett was a progressive reformer who had spent decades promoting agricultural cooperation. He supported Dominion status for Ireland within the British Empire. Anti-treaty forces saw him as a collaborator. His house, filled with art and documents from a lifetime of public service, was destroyed. The violence was strategic and symbolic. Burning a senator's mansion sent a message: cooperation with the Free State meant you were complicit in partition and compromise. If you accepted the treaty, you were choosing the British connection over full Irish sovereignty. Your house, like your politics, deserved to burn. But the campaign was also increasingly nihilistic. By mid-1923, military logic had given way to fury and desperation. Anti-treaty forces were losing. Free State troops, better armed and organized, were crushing resistance across the South. Some burnings felt like final acts of defiance, gestures with no strategic value, just rage against defeat. The scale was staggering. Over 200 big houses burned between 1922 and 1923, more than during the entire War of Independence. The landscape was scarred, centuries of architectural heritage obliterated in months. Families with no connection to British rule, who had lived in Ireland for generations, watched their ancestral homes consumed by flames. Photographs from the era show the aftermath: roofless shells, blackened limestone, collapsed floors, chimneys standing alone like monuments to loss. Mansions that had survived Cromwell, the famine, the land war gone. Libraries with irreplaceable collections ash. Art accumulated over centuries destroyed. The Free State government condemned the burnings but could do little to prevent them. Military resources were stretched fighting the wider war. By the time troops arrived, houses were often already burning, and the perpetrators had vanished into the countryside. When the Civil War ended in May 1923, with anti-treaty forces defeated and ordered to dump arms, the burnings stopped. The silence that followed was heavy with loss and bitterness. Ireland had won independence, but at what cost? The landscape was marked by ruins. Communities were divided by hatreds that would take generations to heal. And Ireland faced an impossible question: what do you do with the memory of beauty built on injustice? Do you mourn the architecture? Do you justify its destruction? Can you hold both truths, that the houses were magnificent and that the system they represented had to end? The ruins offered no answer. They simply stood, or failed to stand, as evidence of a revolution that consumed not just people but the physical world they had built. Behind every burned mansion were people whose lives were upended. Landlord families, some of whom had lived in Ireland for generations, watched their ancestral homes consumed by flames. They fled, often at night, carrying what they could, leaving behind centuries of accumulated possessions: furniture, portraits, letters, legal documents, entire archives of family and local history. Some families had been decent landlords by the standards of the time. Some had genuinely tried to reform the system from within. Some had even supported Irish independence. It did not matter. The house was the target, not the nuance of the individual's record. The flight was often chaotic and terrifying. Raiders typically gave warnings, sometimes hours, sometimes only minutes. Families gathered children, grabbed essential documents, and evacuated while volunteers poured paraffin through the rooms and struck matches. Some watched from nearby hills as their homes burned. Others were already miles away, heading for Dublin or the nearest port to England. What was lost went beyond buildings. Family papers documenting centuries of local administration, correspondence with political and cultural figures, photographs capturing vanished ways of life, all turned to ash. Libraries built over generations went up like kindling. First editions, rare manuscripts, collections that would have enriched national archives, destroyed in minutes. The psychological impact was profound. For families who had defined themselves by their estates, by their place in the social order, the burning represented total erasure. Not just loss of property, but loss of identity, purpose, and future. Many never recovered financially or emotionally. They settled in England or Dublin, diminished, living on reduced circumstances, haunted by what they had lost. Servants lost jobs, homes, and security. When a big house burned, the entire ecosystem collapsed. Gardeners, grooms, cooks, maids they scattered, seeking work in a country devastated by years of war, where employment was scarce and distrust was high. Servants who had spent decades with a family found themselves unemployed in middle age, their skills specialized to an institution that no longer existed. The violence traumatized communities. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for years found themselves on opposite sides. Families divided between those who supported the burnings as necessary political action and those who saw them as criminal destruction. In small townlands, these divisions persisted for decades. People stopped speaking to relatives. Marriages were broken, friendships ended. There were also unintended casualties. In several documented cases, people died in the fire's servants who refused to leave, elderly family members unable to evacuate quickly, occasionally volunteers whose paraffin ignited prematurely. These deaths were rarely acknowledged publicly. The human cost was real on all sides. Landlord families genuinely suffered, servants lost livelihoods, communities were fractured. And yet the suffering of those who lost their big houses existed alongside the generational suffering of those who had lived under the system those houses represented. Tenant families who had endured evictions, hunger, and landlessness for centuries felt little sympathy for landlords mourning lost mansions. History struggles to weigh these costs against each other. The loss was real. The houses were gone, the families displaced, the heritage destroyed. But so was the oppression that preceded it. Both truths sit in the ruins, unreconciled. 50 years after the burnings, Ireland had to reckon with what it had destroyed. By the 1970s, attitudes were shifting. Scholars, architects, and preservationists began cataloguing the ruins, documenting what had been lost. The Irish Georgian Society was founded in 1958, partly in response to ongoing demolitions not by revolutionaries, but by developers and neglect. Many big houses that survived the Civil War were demolished in the 1950s and 60s because they were expensive to maintain and no longer politically defensible. The ruins that remained became contested symbols. To some, they were reminders of oppression, monuments to colonialism best left to decay. To others, they were irreplaceable architectural heritage, part of Ireland's history regardless of politics. The debate was fierce. Nationalists argued that preserving big houses amounted to celebrating colonialism, that scarce resources should go to housing for ordinary Irish people, not maintaining symbols of Protestant ascendancy. Why spend money stabilizing ruins that represented centuries of exploitation? Let them fall. Let nature reclaim them. Their decay was justice. Preservationists countered that architecture transcends politics, that Georgian Ireland produced buildings of international significance, that destroying them impoverished Ireland's cultural heritage. History, they argued, must be preserved even when uncomfortable, especially when uncomfortable. UNESCO and international preservation groups pressured Ireland to protect what survived. The attention was unwelcome in some quarters, foreign interference in Irish affairs. But it provided leverage for domestic preservationists who lacked political support. Slowly, grudgingly, attitudes shifted. A more complex narrative emerged. Yes, these houses represented colonial power. Yes, their burning was a political act rooted in justified rage. And yes, their loss was also a cultural tragedy. Both things could be true. The houses could be acknowledged as architectural masterpieces and as instruments of oppression. Preservation did not require celebration. It required context. Ireland began haltingly to preserve selected ruins. Moore Hall in County Mayo, burned in 1923, was stabilized in the 1990s. The walls were reinforced to prevent collapse, but no roof was added. It remains a roofless shell, a deliberate monument to loss, accessible to the public, interpreted not as glorious past, but as evidence of violent, necessary rupture. Strokestown Park in County Roscommon was restored and turned into a museum in the 1990s. But unlike traditional country house museums that celebrate aristocratic life, Strokestown explicitly addresses the estate's role in the famine. Exhibitions detail evictions carried out by the Mann family, tenants suffering, and the 1847 assassination of Major Denys Marn by tenants who blamed him for their misery. The house becomes pedagogical, teaching the full, difficult story. Other ruins were left to decay with dignity. Tyrone House in Galway stands roofless and empty, its Gothic revival windows framing sky, ivy climbing limestone walls. It attracts photographers and tourists drawn to romantic ruin. But plaques now provide context: who lived here, how they made their money, why the house burned. The ruins became not monuments to celebrate, but evidence to study. They teach that beauty and injustice can coexist, that revolutions destroy as well as create, that history is never simple. Ireland's burned castles are scars on the landscape, reminders that the past cannot be erased or resolved, only reckoned with over and over in each generation. Every big house was built by Irish hands. Stonemasons from local quarries cut limestone and dressed it into blocks. Carpenters from nearby towns shaped oak and dealt the intricate joinery. Plasterers mixed lime and horsehair and crafted ceilings that would last centuries. These were skilled trades passed down through generations, often within families. The work was hard, dangerous, and seasonal. Pay was better than farm labor, but inconsistent. A mason might work 6 months on a big house project, then face unemployment through winter. Injuries were common: falls from scaffolding, crushed hands, silicosis from stone dust. There were no safety regulations, no insurance, no recourse. Yet the craftsmen took pride in their work. Their skill is still visible in the ruins, even blackened by fire. The precision of the stonework, the elegance of the proportions endure. A well-cut voussoir in an archway, carved 2 centuries ago, still locks perfectly into place. Plasterwork that survived the flames shows details so fine you can see individual feathers on birds, the veins in sculpted leaves. This was not careless labor, this was mastery. The builders were caught in a paradox. They created beauty for a system that oppressed them. A stonemason cutting blocks for a big house facade earned wages, yes, better than what tenant farmers made. But he could never own the house he built, never live in it except as a servant, never inherit the land his ancestors had worked for generations. His labor enriched his employer. His skill made someone else's vision real. And when his work was done, he returned to a cottage with a thatched roof and dirt floor. Their names were not recorded. Estate archives list payments to contractors, bulk sums for masonry or carpentry. Individual craftsmen disappear into anonymity. The architects were celebrated: Richard Castles, James Gandon, names still known today. The landlords were remembered, their portraits hanging in museums. The builders vanished. Occasionally fragments survive. A signature scratched into wet plaster in an attic, hidden when no one would see. Initials carved into a roof beam. A date stone with a mason's mark. These are rare. Mostly, the builders left no trace except their work. When the big houses burned, the craftsmen's legacy burned with them. Ceilings they had labored over collapsed. Staircases they had calculated and assembled splintered. Stone walls they had dressed and set cracked in the heat. The irony is brutal. The houses were destroyed as symbols of oppression. But the houses were also monuments to Irish skill, Irish artistry, Irish labor. The question remains unresolved. When you burn a building to destroy what it represents, do you also destroy the work of the people who built it? The craftsmen who carved those stones and shaped that oak were not landlords. They were workers. Their labor was exploited, yes, but their skill was real. Their artistry mattered. The ruins today are their monument, unintended and ambiguous. The houses they built could not protect them from the system those houses embodied. But the quality of their work outlasted the landlords, outlasted the British Empire in Ireland, outlasted even the buildings themselves. In the shells that remain, in the precision of joints and the elegance of proportions, the forgotten builders speak. The burning of the big houses forces an ethical question preservation movements rarely confront. Should all architecture be saved, regardless of its political meaning? The standard argument for preservation is aesthetic and historical. These buildings are beautiful. They represent craftsmanship. They are part of the historical record. But beauty is not neutral. Architecture is never apolitical. The big houses were instruments of power. They enforced hierarchy visually, spatially, economically. To preserve them uncritically is to preserve the worldview they embodied. Yet to destroy them erases evidence. Evidence of oppression, yes, but also of resistance, of how people lived and worked, of the material culture of a vanished era. Buildings are documents. They record social relationships, economic systems, technological capabilities, aesthetic values. When you burn a mansion, you lose not just stone and wood, but information encoded in the structure itself, how rooms were arranged to separate classes, how service corridors kept labor invisible, how architectural choices reinforced power. The preservationist argument runs deeper than aesthetics. Historic buildings, even oppressive ones, teach us how systems of power operated. Plantations in the American South are preserved not to celebrate slavery but to confront it, to make visible the spatial organization of exploitation. The same logic applies to Ireland's big houses. These buildings show how colonialism functioned on the ground, how wealth was extracted and displayed, how architecture served as propaganda. The counter-argument is equally strong. Preservation is not neutral curation. It is a choice about what matters, what deserves resources, whose history gets protected. When governments spend money stabilizing landlord mansions while ordinary people's homes are lost to development or neglect, that sends a message about whose past is valued. And for communities that lived under the boot of the big house system, being asked to preserve those houses as heritage can feel like being asked to honor their own oppression. Ireland's solution has been selective and interpretive. Not all ruins are preserved. Some are left to decay, a form of natural demonumentalization. The landscape absorbs them slowly, roofs collapse, walls crumble, vegetation reclaims stone. This is not vandalism. It is a choice to let certain symbols of power fade rather than fighting to maintain them. The ruins that are preserved are recontextualized. Strokestown Park does not celebrate the Mann family. It indicts them, presenting evidence of evictions and tenants suffering alongside the elegant rooms. Moore Hall is not restored to glory. It is stabilized as a ruin, a memorial to rupture, not continuity. This approach acknowledges complexity. The houses were beautiful and oppressive. Their destruction was justified rage and cultural loss. Preservation can serve justice if it includes reckoning, if the story told is full and honest, if the communities most affected have voice in how memory is shaped. There is no perfect answer. But Ireland's struggle with its big houses offers a model. Preservation must include accountability. Architecture can be protected without being celebrated. History can be remembered without being glorified. The ruins teach us that beauty built on injustice remains beautiful and unjust, and we must hold both truths if we are to learn anything at all. Today, Ireland's landscape is still marked by the big houses, both standing and ruined. Some have been restored as hotels, event venues, private homes. Some are open to the public as museums. Some stand roofless and empty, slowly reclaimed by ivy and rain. Each serves as a reminder, wealth, power, and beauty are temporary. Systems that seem permanent can collapse in a generation. And the ghosts of injustice do not vanish just because the buildings do. The story of Ireland's burned castles is not unique. Colonial architecture faces similar reckonings: worldwide plantations in the American South, apartheid-era estates in South Africa, colonial mansions across Asia and Africa. The questions are the same. What do we do with beautiful buildings built on exploitation? How do we remember without glorifying? How do we preserve without erasing the suffering encoded in the stones? Ireland offers no tidy answer, but it offers an example of a country wrestling honestly with the contradictions of its architectural heritage, refusing both to erase history and to celebrate it uncritically. Some big houses have been repurposed in ways that acknowledge their past. Castletown House is now owned by the state and operates as a museum. Tours discuss the Connolly family's wealth, derived from land speculation, alongside the building's architectural significance. The house is presented as both masterpiece and monument to inequality. Others have become luxury hotels. Ashford Castle, Dramaland Castle, these estates cater to wealthy tourists seeking aristocratic fantasy. Critics argue this romanticizes brutal history. Defenders counter that adaptive reuse keeps buildings alive and generates employment. The ruins themselves have become pilgrimage sites. Photographers document their decay. Historians study them. Locals tell stories about what happened, who lived and died, why the fires were set. What lessons do the ashes teach? First, that architecture is always political. Buildings shape behavior, enforce hierarchies, communicate values. The big houses were designed to project permanence. They failed. No stone could protect them once the political ground shifted. Second, that beauty and injustice coexist. The houses were magnificent and complicit. Acknowledging both requires honesty. It is easier to simplify, to condemn everything, or romanticize everything. Truth lies in the uncomfortable middle. Third, that destruction is also loss. Even justified violence destroys irreplaceable things. Burned libraries, lost art, erased archives cannot be recovered. Revolutions require sacrifice. Ireland sacrificed architectural heritage for independence. Whether that was necessary remains debated. Fourth, that memory is work. The ruins do not speak for themselves. They require interpretation, context, ongoing effort to tell stories fully. Left alone, they become romantic backdrops. Engaged critically, they become teachers. Ireland's burned castles stand as monuments to ambition and oppression, craft and exploitation, revolution and loss. They cannot be rebuilt. They can only be remembered as completely and honestly as possible, so the past they represent is neither erased nor repeated.